A lot of economists and analysts are talking about a new normal. And I get what they're trying to say, but I think that phrase really misses the mark. Things changed with the pandemic, but where we're at today, I wouldn't call this a new normal. I think we're more in a period of transition, massive transition, and there's a lot of tension and stress in the economy and in global relations. My friend Bruce Mehlman describes where we're at as a period of disequilibrium. I think that's a perfect description for where we find ourselves today. Bruce is the head of Mehlman Consulting. He is one of Washington, D.C.'s top lobbyists. He's very much plugged in to what's happening in Washington and beyond, and I'm really eager for you to get his thoughts today. Bruce, it's always good to see you. I want to read to you your own words just to set the stage for this conversation. You write, "The world is out of balance. The disruptive changes that were already rewiring the economy, geopolitics, and U.S. culture accelerated over the past 3 years, and a predictable backlash began. But we are nowhere close to a new normal." I agree with that. Can you explain to me why you say that?
Sure, and thanks again for having me on, Ed. I love watching these, so I don't know if I want to watch myself, but I'm grateful to be invited. A huge amount of what we do is to try to help business leaders and investors and political folks understand what's happening, to help anticipate what's going to happen next and predict what's going to happen next. And it's been difficult for everybody to predict. I'm a huge fan of Malden Economics. I read everything that they come out with. But will there be a recession this year? I've read lots of smart things that make me convinced yes, and lots of smart things that make me convinced no. Is inflation going up, or are we heading back to disinflation? Is the Republican Party kind of forever lost in a conspiracism that will allow the Democrats to have a new standing majority, or is Governor DeSantis going to going to be able to recapture the middle as the Democrats kind of go off into a woke left outfield? And the answer is both are entirely possible. It's never been a more fluid, more dynamic, harder to predict environment. And I think a lot of that's because the old equilibriums that say were the Cold War, where you got how geopolitics worked, or even the post-Cold War, that's not where we are anymore. But we haven't reached some new normal where we know what our relationship with China is going to be. And likewise, the economy was already adjusting, but it has all of these shocks from the pandemic and all of these shocks from the Russia-Ukraine war. We're not at some new stable place yet. And that's true with policy as well.
You broke down 3 major sections of the world that are in disequilibrium. So let's just break those down further, right? You started with the economy. And again, I just couldn't agree more that, I hear some economists talking about how we're in a new normal. And while I agree with them that the post-COVID economy is going to be very different than it was pre-COVID, we're not in a new normal yet. If anything, we're in a new abnormal. It's going to be years before we figure out where this all settles out. So there's a lot of things that happened. For example, China and the U.S. 10 years ago, we were happily married or pretty close to that. Now it feels downright scary, the relationship that we have with each other. How do you see that playing out?
There are certainly a bunch of options on the economy. I wish I could tell you I would have been a much more successful investor if I knew which way, say, the markets are going to go. Louis Gov, you guys cover all the time, and GovCal, their theory and many others' theory is that one of the key growth engines this year is going to be China. And that after the failure of COVID zero or zero COVID, it's like Coke Zero, a zero COVID, they bit the bullet. A lot of people died in China, but now they're reopened, combined with their recognition that their efforts against their own real estate market, their own tech titans hurt their economy. And so their theory is that China is going to really hit the jets and that's going to power a lot of the global economy. If that's the case, that's really good for emerging markets. That means oil is going to be expensive. That has downstream implications for the United States. At the same time, the U.S. increasingly, the most bipartisan belief in Washington right now is that China is a risk, maybe even that the Communist Party is an existential risk to the United States. So we're seeing a tightening of the screws in areas such as semiconductors and areas like advanced technology. There's some talk that perhaps because Chinese firms are helping the Russian war machine, that there will be secondary sanctions, which would have broad, profound downstream economic implications. There was an attempt we saw both by the Biden administration and the President Xi in China to kind of turn the temperature down a little bit to reduce the likelihood of of unintended activities leading to kinetic, really scary stuff. And then that stupid balloon flew over the United States, which some people think was spying. Other people say was no more sophisticated than satellites. Ian Bremmer, who I know you've had on, his theory is that probably was an accident at first, but then they predictably lied about it. And we probably would have let it go, and except some, far-sighted dudes in Montana saw it. And so then domestic politics over, and we had to blow it up once it went over the coast of South Carolina. It's the desired outcomes and the potential unlikely outcomes are not always one and the same.
That gets into one of the other areas that you talk about, which was geopolitics. It's not just China, right? It's Russia. Heck, North Korea is launching missiles over Japan again, and it doesn't even make the front page of the paper. That's how active the geopolitical scene is in the world right now. I don't think it's felt this scary since maybe 9/11. I mean, it feels pretty dark right now geopolitically.
Well, look, I agree with you. Of course, we haven't had a major power land war in Europe since World War II. So, if you feel scared by geopolitics, trust your instincts on that. There's a lot of scary stuff. I do think that kind of the future state, the equilibrium that we're not at yet, one of the characteristics will be some kind of little bit more predictable U.S. and China state of affairs. Some people think it's a new Cold War. I think it's a different Cold War. I think we're going to have a level of decoupling from China that absolutely involves technology and involves things of military capability. But I don't think we're going to stop selling them soybeans. I think even China hawks want to keep selling them soybeans. And by all logic, we're going to need to keep buying things from them. So a huge amount of what's going on right now will be a line drawing. There's obviously a need or a great hope that they don't invade Taiwan. And a huge amount of what's happening geopolitically right now are efforts by Taiwan and allies to help make Taiwan a lot harder to invade and to help make the likelihood of sanctions sufficiently unpleasant that China doesn't want to go in. Yet that also requires a little bit of diplomatic discipline in the West to not, put the battery on our shoulder and say, we dare you to knock this off, because, at some point you force actions that you don't want and they don't want. And so it's highly fluid now. It feels like the 2020s will be a very dynamic decade. And other things that I've published, and as I look about it here, I feel like towards the end of this decade, and John has talked about in his writing, John Malden, the Great Reset. It feels like the new equilibrium is the other side economically of the Great Reset, geopolitically of finding our footing with us and China as to how we can coexist and be hopefully frenemies, in a more stable way, and not like you and I are saying, where we're worried because Air Force generals are getting, sending memos to their leadership saying they expect to go to war by 2025, as happened.
So you sit in D.C., you have an interesting vantage point of what's happening. How does a president manage a consistent foreign policy, project a consistent foreign policy when we're so divided, right? But both nationally and then in DC, we're incredibly divided. And we have, you mentioned Taiwan, right? I mean, Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. Whether you agree with that message that she was sending or not, unless that was a backroom deal with the administration and coordinated, how do you, as an executive, manage that? How does the president manage that when he can't control the message being sent out of Washington?
Well, of course, you're right. The hyperpartisanship in Washington makes it difficult to do things that historically seemed easier. Although, as you know, I spend a lot of time reading and looking at history, because so many things that we're struggling with today are echoes, if not direct repeats, of things that have been happening in the past. And people who say this has never happened before just simply didn't go back looking for it, because it's all happened before. But some hope, perhaps, Ed, we can take from the fact that, Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan. Speaker McCarthy is going to go to Taiwan. Senator McConnell believes that we need to give more aid to Ukraine. President Biden is trying to do more for Ukraine. Concern about China and the Communist Party of China is, as I noted, the most bipartisan thing. Shortly after it took 15 rounds of voting for Speaker McCarthy to get all the Republicans on side to agree to make him Speaker, you had a vote that was overwhelmingly bipartisan to establish a select committee on China. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that the opposition party doesn't and won't continue to take shots. The Democrats took shots at Trump. Republicans took shots at Obama. Democrats took shot at W. Bush. And Republicans now will take shots at anything that doesn't seem to work out, like the fairly shambolic retreat from Afghanistan. At the same time, there's actually a more bipartisanship on Taiwan and Russia, North Korea, than almost any other issue we can, certainly not the debt ceiling, but almost any other issue we can come up with.
Yeah, that was interesting, that part of your presentation where you indicate that you think this Congress will actually get a lot more done than people are expecting.
Well, it helps to have low expectations, right? So people are assuming this Congress can't pass the Mother's Day resolution, and I'm going to take the over on that one. But I do think, the media at the end of the day is in a business. So their business is how do you get you to watch? How do I get you to click? And the answer is present outrage, make you angry. It's angertainment more and more. And so as a result, they're going to cover the hardest things or the most partisan things. Last Congress, if you ask the average American, they'd say government's divided, they can't do anything. And you go back and you look at last Congress, the infrastructure legislation was $1 trillion, an extraordinary investment that both parties and presidents of both parties had been saying they wanted to do. The CHIPS and Science Act was $250 billion, incredible investment there. The Inflation Reduction Act, admittedly, that was not bipartisan, that was partisan, but huge impact for businesses downstream. And marriage equality, for example, was a bipartisan deal. There's postal reform, and Congress gets a lot of things done. It just doesn't get the same coverage and the same ink. I think we're going to have an immense amount of coverage over the really nasty and admittedly very big debt deficit fights. But I also think there's going to be a lot of smaller things, a lot of clients that we work on, a lot of things that have a big impact on business, from telehealth to cyber to crypto, where there's actual bipartisanship, and they will be able to move those things. We're just going to spend less. It's like, why do you not notice the good news in the newspaper? Because the bad news gets, the headlines and causes us to be upset and to focus. But there's actually been a lot of really good news over the last 5 years.
I had a conversation with Andrew Yang a few weeks ago, and he was mentioning that both parties, both sides of the aisle, really are benefiting from how divided this country is. And that kind of segues us into the cultural aspect of your presentation. There's a couple of maps making their way around the internet right now. One we've all seen before. It's just the red state versus blue state map, right? And you look at it that way, and the country looks very, very red in terms of state count. And then there's another map going around that shows red versus blue by population center. And that one looks very blue in comparison. I think that the truth is each side can find a way to present that they're the dominant way of thinking. The reality is we're just very divided. Does that break, in your opinion?
It's fascinating, and it means two things. And again, my audience being business leaders trying to plan and look ahead, or investors, or even political folks. At the federal level, we are insanely closely divided. Fewer than 50,000 votes if you switched in the 2020 presidential election, Trump beats Biden. Fewer than 80,000 votes in 2016 if you switch. And again, in a couple of key states, Hillary wins the Electoral College. This current House majority, if the Democrats were allowed, they could change fewer than 7,000 votes in 5 districts, and the Democrats are the majority in the House right now. Which is incredibly small. That you go back and the last time it was the second narrowest in the Congress before that, when the Democrats had a majority of equally small, net 5 size. So at the federal level, we're on razor's edge. Every election for the last decade has changed either the House, the Senate, and or the White House. So for businesses trying to plan, you never have more than 2 years of consistent leadership. So at the federal level, incredibly likely to change, incredibly short tenured majorities. The average House majority in the 20th century was twice as long as in the 21st. The average Senate majority in the 20th century was twice as long for a party control as in the 21st. That's the federal picture. At the state level, we have 39 states with the so-called trifecta, where one party, the Republicans and the Democrats, control the House, the state Senate, and the governorship. That's a 40-year high at the state level. So not surprisingly, we find the federal level hard to plan, hard to predict, hard to keep still, hard to pass often big things. Whereas at the state level, the parties are seeing more opportunity to move forward. And if you combine that with the Supreme Court's increasingly frequent rulings that say that defer to states and reduce the power of the federal bureaucracy, what you find now is more and more states are disagreeing with each other and have a tailwind to advance policies. So in areas economic policy, unionization, or ESG, or abortion rights, states increasingly are diverging and are setting the pace, and the so-called patchwork quilt is getting harder and harder to navigate.
One of the other areas that I think there's some disequilibrium in is just who's going to be running the country in the future. I mean, Nikki Haley recently announced, and she was pretty overt in saying it's time for a new generation to take over, move over. You had Feinstein say she isn't going to be running again. DeSantis it sounds like, is going to run. He's in his 40s, I believe. Do you think that is yet another disequilibrium element to government, where we're going to have a whole new generation that's going to be coming into power?
Well, look, I mean, at some point you have to have a new generation, and the Republicans in the House a decade ago kind of moved to McCarthy and late 40s, early 50s folks. The Democrats just made the jump after Speaker Pelosi, she and Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn had been, the three amigos leading the Democratic Party for 20 years. They were all in their 80s, and they've just stepped down, and a new generation stepped up there. So it feels like it's happening. It's happening in a lot of ways. At the presidential level, it's not happening yet. And there is a very realistic possibility that we're going to see a refighting of the last war. Certainly, Donald Trump has thrown his hat back in the ring. Everything one observes makes it clear that President Biden plans to run again. So, if it's they say sequels are never good as the original, but it sure feels like Biden v. Trump round 2 is heading our way. That's the opposite of generational change. You're right. You have a lot of candidates trying to make the case against President Trump. I personally tend to think that it's time for a new generation will be less effective against President Trump than it's time for somebody who can win. Because, President Trump presided over the loss of the House in 2018, the loss of the White House in 2020, the loss of the Senate in 2021, and in 2022, as a result of the candidates that he promoted for the Senate, the failure to recapture the Senate. For a lot of folks across the Republican Party, across the conservative establishment, there's a sense, that he may have led the party to the potential promised land, but he can't lead them in. It's time to turn to somebody with a lot less baggage, who's able to bring in independence and not lose to Joe Biden again.
On the other side of the aisle, I think you're hearing some of that as well, more related to Biden's age. But what about the number 2 spot, the vice president spot? I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball. It's probably an unfair question, but we haven't heard much about Kamala Harris since she got into office. And what we have heard, in my opinion, hasn't been all that flattering. I don't think she inspires a lot of confidence among either party. So you've got Trump, who might be running. He's probably not going to run with Pence. Does Biden have to run with Harris? Is there talk that maybe there's a change there? Because I think that changes the calculus on his odds.
Yeah. So, You're right. All the polling to date done where if Vice President Harris were at the top of the ticket, she gets beat pretty bad by pretty much anybody you put on the Republican side, including former President Trump. Now, obviously, when you actually run the campaign, it would get tighter per se. But most Democratic strategists believe that she has not made the sale, that she might not win a Democratic primary, and that she would not win in a general. And part of the reason a lot of Democrats think Joe Biden will run, besides the fact that I think he believes he's been successful and he likes being president, is they don't tend to see who was the obvious successor, and they're afraid of kind of an open mic night. Open mic night in 2020 was bringing us Bernie Sanders before, the establishment said, everybody else drop out, let's make it Joe Biden. I don't think there's any chance that Vice President Harris is defenestrated, though. I think, they're going to keep, she is a younger woman of color. That's just, throwing her out against her will is not smart for the base, is not something that they would, I don't think they have any intention or plan of doing. It sends a perceived signal of disloyalty, and so she will not be off the ticket. However, I will bet you as much as you want that Mike Pence will not be the vice presidential wingman of President Trump should he be the nominee. It's the one thing I'm sure of in politics.
I should have started this interview, by the way, Bruce, by saying that you do manage a bipartisan consulting and lobbying firm. And I'm trying to just look at both sides. But I guarantee you, I've probably already alienated half of our viewers. And the comments that we'll get back will be 50-50 as to which side we favor, even though they're watching the same content. It's just how it goes in this country right now. It's kind of a sign of the times.
Oh, I do a lot of public speaking, and my background is as a Republican. I work hard as I can to be down the middle of the fairway. Ironically, the people who are most likely to complain about me, I have found, are not Democrats who think I'm coloring it for Republicans, but rather the Trump wing of the Republican Party who think I, dismiss his messianic capabilities, which I do. But look, everybody's people are far more likely to see the other party as a threat to their way of life. People also are far more likely to take offense than they used to be. It seems to me, I want to hear what the other side thinks. I may not agree with them, but that doesn't make them a threat to my way of life. I don't want to ban their books, and I don't think they should ban my ability to appear at the university. And yet, both sides think the other side is a threat to free speech. We go into a lot of that because businesses are needing to navigate these culture wars more than they ever had, where the left believes business leaders should speak out in favor of ESG. The right believes business leaders need to speak out against ESG. Our advice to business leaders are don't take a stand if you don't have a plan, but you better have a plan, and the plan can't be never engaged, and the plan can't be always engaged.
So navigating Washington today has to be incredibly difficult for a large company. What sorts of things are you suggesting your clients watch out for?
Look, you're right, although I feel like, Ed, if we were doing this during the Clinton-Newt era, we'd be saying, man, it's harder to navigate Washington than it's ever been. And if we were right now, we would have been right then. So some of my perspective is, number one, you've got to engage. It seems like you can't get things done until suddenly everything gets done. The people who engaged when it didn't look like there was going to be tax reform got baked into the blueprints. And when finally we did have tax reform, they were part of the underlying bill. So you've got to engage, number one. Number two, you've got to be bipartisan. You're going to need Republican support. You're going to need Democratic support. Again, don't believe the caricatures that are on social media. Don't believe, Fox, Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. Most members of Congress and their staff ran for the right reasons and want to do the right things, but they need help. So number three, don't get frustrated because they don't understand your business. Anybody watching this would not automatically be a member of Congress who understood enough about healthcare policy to be smart on healthcare policy and defense and energy, and technology. At the end of the day, Another reason to engage is they need to understand what the real world, what the real world consequences of their, reasonable goals, but they just don't have the domain expertise. So they want to hear from business leaders, and a lot of business leaders would say they came, they made their point. How come they're not doing what I say? But those same business leaders wouldn't say the same thing about sales calls. If you ask them about sales, they're like, look, you got to, you don't know if it's one sales call or 10 sales calls. Maybe it's the first time you take them to golf or the 8th time you take them to dinner. You need persistence. Why, if you need persistence in selling your product, do they not recognize you need persistence in selling your economic policies and your ideas? So you got to engage, you got to be bipartisan, and you got to be persistent.
Bruce, I really love your slide decks. I'm going to have a link to it below, and I'm hoping that you will do another one in May for our strategic investment conference, and then we'll just give you the camera and you can go through the entire deck.
I'll be happy to, though. Note to you and to the readers. Look, the Strategic Investment Conference is an amazing conference. I'm excited less because I get to speak there, which is nice, but rather to hear everybody else because they're all so smart. What I do, I publish these quarterly. Any Malden economics fan is welcome to email me, and I'll add you to the list. It costs nothing, so the price is right. You will find, though, these are fairly dense presentations. When I present at SIC, I do a presentation deck, which is a lot friendlier to an audience than a handout where you can't explain what people are seeing. But I'll definitely look to have fresh content to try to offer what's happening in Washington and what's influencing Washington, both domestically and around the world. Look forward to seeing you there and appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Bruce Mehlman from Mehlman Consulting. Always great talking with you. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ed.